Welcome back, everybody. Well, it is December 7th, 2022, and many of us know it is Pearl Harbor Day. It's a day that for many years here in the United States was actually observed as a holiday, much like has been the case with September 11th, where it's a day that we kind of reflect and remember, and there's a lot of events associated with that. And I imagine that September 11th will fade in memory just as December 7th has. But for now, we're going to dive into a little bit of the backstory. We all know about what happened that day with the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But our friends at Extra Credits, their extra history content, have begun a series called The Path to Pearl Harbor. And the first 2 episodes are live. So we're actually going to do a reaction to both episodes in one today. And then I'll catch up with part 3 when it comes out, probably this weekend. As always, the link is in the description. It'll take you to the beginning of episode 1, their version of it without my commentary if you want to check that out. But let's go ahead and dive into The Path to Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor, October 1940. Admiral James Richardson cables the Chief of Naval Operations, demanding to know why the heck he's here. In April, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had left its home base in California to conduct exercises in the Pacific. Then 1 month in, he'd received orders to issue a press release stating that he was remaining at Pearl Harbor on naval business.
So it's interesting to note that in 1940, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's home base is where? It's in California. It's home, really. I mean, remember, Hawaii is just a U.S. territory at this point. It's only been a U.S. territory for less than 50 years. So while Pearl Harbor is a naval base, it's really far out there, and the conventional wisdom is if it's that far out, it really can't do a lot of good, and it's just a lot easier to keep it closer to home. But now things are changing. Well, what has changed? Well, the Japanese have invaded China. They are spreading their wings, so to speak, throughout the Pacific region. And so now tension's starting to ramp up.
He's furious. He has no business here. And what he'd been told would be a 2-week stay has stretched to 6 months. Pearl Harbor is a forward station. It doesn't have the facilities to properly house, supply, or repair the fleet. Re-enlistments are down. Ammunition and fuel short. Morale has collapsed. Why is his fleet being left to rot? Finally, he gets an answer. President Roosevelt wants the fleet in Pearl Harbor as a deterrent against Japanese attack in the Dutch East Indies and to give America leverage in diplomatic negotiations. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is now a pawn in a high-stakes game, one where Roosevelt, unknowingly, is running out of time.
And it's important to note that the U.S. only starts to become kind of a player on the world stage in a big way when we start building our Navy, and that happens under the previous Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy at one point, basically ran the department for all intents and purposes, and did a pretty good job of getting the U.S. on the proper footing to start building a Navy. And once they could build a Navy, that's when you start to see things like the Spanish-American War. You start to see the U.S. start grabbing territories like the Philippines and Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Panama. And the Navy, they understood, was an extension of being able to exert your influence on the world stage. It was the Navy that we used to get Japan to open up in the first place under Matthew Perry.
Say, would you like to see the next episode of this series immediately after watching this one instead of waiting a full week? Well, now with the new Nebula First, you totally can. Learn how to get access through the Curiosity Stream Nebula bundle after the episode. Hey everyone, quick note up top. This series will be drawing on 2 previous shows we've done about the history of Japan. Of course, you don't need to have watched them, but we're also not going to repeat some info on previous topics much. So, if you want extra background or just to brush up, you can check out our completed series on the end of the samurai and Japanese militarism.
I guess I
Links
need
to
to do
those
this.
in the description, but now, on to the infamy.
We need to do that.
December 7th, 1941 is one of the most famous dates in world history. The day that the Empire of Japan attacked the U.S. naval station at Pearl Harbor, bringing an unaware America into World War II. That is, traditionally, how it's told in textbooks and documentaries.
Wouldn't say we're unaware. Did it catch us by surprise? Yeah. Did we know that something was going to happen? I think it's fair to say we did.
But it's not the full story, or even, in many ways, the real story of how and why these countries came to blows. Because mere weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, diplomats were still negotiating for peace, and even proposing that Roosevelt and Japanese Prime Minister Prince Konoye meet face to face. In fact, the road to December 7th was a crooked one, fraught with tense meetings, cultural misunderstandings, and dismissed warnings. A surprise attack that remained a surprise, even though the US State Department had decrypted and was reading Japanese diplomatic cables about the operation.
Yep.
But to trace the roots of this conflict, we have to go back much further than 1940. We're heading back to the late 19th century, when both Japan and the United States emerged as Pacific empires. Both were late to Pacific colonialism.
Yeah.
By the 1870s, Spanish colonies in the Philippines and the Marianas were already 3 centuries old.
So this region, the South Pacific, is, along with Africa, part of the 19th century colonialism. Remember, the first real era of colonialism is when we're in the 15 and 1600s, right? When you've got North America and South America being colonized by the British and the Dutch briefly. They had New Amsterdam, which today is New York City. But the Dutch, I mean, there are even some Swedes who kind of settle in the area around Philadelphia. Of course, you've got the Portuguese and the French and the Spanish. But all of that now, in the 1800s has blown up, and most of those colonies have gotten their freedom. There's a few here and there, like Cuba for the Spanish. But the focus has shifted, and it's gone to Africa, and now it's gone out here, and it's the same countries, right? It's the Dutch, it's the Germans, it's the French, it's the Italians, it's the English.
As were Dutch possessions in modern Indonesia. Heck, the British had been in Australia since the late 18th century, but the US and Japan, by contrast, had been constrained by internal factors, and only began to scramble for territory in the late 1800s. Japan, its centuries-long isolation, ended by the expedition of American Admiral Perry.
All right, time out. Just a tiny correction here. Matthew Perry was not an admiral. He died before the U.S. even had the admiral rank. I think he died in the 1850s. He was Commodore. Commodore was the highest rank the U.S. had at the time. In fact, at the beginning of the American Civil War, and by that point Perry's dead, we didn't even have the rank admiral then, so you'll see guys referred to as flag officer, which is like Andrew Foote and David Farragut. Before they actually create the rank admiral, they just call them flag officer, which is Commodore is like this rank that's in between captain and rear admiral, and it's not really used anymore.
Its centuries-long isolation ended by the expedition of American Admiral Perry, wanted to be counted among the great powers. And that meant establishing a colonial empire. It started slowly at first, with the addition of islands, such as Okinawa, that it considered part of its historical borders. Then it moved on to Taiwan, Korea, and Sakhalin Island, spoils of the First Sino-Japanese War and Russo-Japanese War. The United States had a similar delay, since it had only become a Pacific power in the 1840s, when the Mexican-American War won it the Southwest and California, and a treaty with the UK ceded it the Oregon Country.
But even then, like I said earlier, we don't really have much of a navy to speak of, at least not a big enough navy to be exerting power in a significant way in the Pacific.
Yet its first official forays into exerting power in its new Pacific domain, like Perry's expedition to Japan, were put on hold during the Civil War. But even then, U.S. expansionism continued, because U.S. interests in the Pacific were not initially territorial, but rather commercial and religious. Merchants trying to strike it rich in the China trade established trading enclaves, and American whalers spread across the Pacific from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Plus, New England missionaries set down on nearly every island and port city from Honolulu to Yokohama.
And this is true throughout history, right? I mean, what are some of the primary catalysts for expansion and going to new places? Religion is a huge one. Look at the Muslim expansion. Look at the ways that Christianity is trying to be spread to the New World. When the colonists first arrive. Trade and religion are two huge catalysts for going into new places. And so it's not unusual at all for that to be the case here.
So, though not officially part of the US government or its plans, this American presence forced the State Department to set up embassies and consulates at a rapid pace to serve these Americans abroad. Not to mention, the purchase of Alaska in 1867 also increased American reach. But both the whaling industry and the China trade were dependent on reliable resupply stations, especially for the coal increasingly used to power ships. And since the best ports in the mid-Pacific, such as the Kingdom of Hawaii, imposed high taxes on refueling, the US began looking for alternatives. It first claimed Midway Island, an uninhabited atoll that was part of the Hawaiian island chain in 1859, but the first efforts to dredge it into a useful harbor ended in disaster when the project failed and a naval vessel wrecked on return. So the US Navy began looking to a more suitable location. After all, would it not be helpful to set up a naval station inside the Kingdom of Hawaii?
Yeah, necessity is the mother of invention, right? I mean, there's probably no real powerful reason for wanting to occupy Hawaii until it becomes advantageous militarily or diplomatically or economically to do so.
In 1875, during the reign of King Kalakaua, the Hawaiian government signed a free trade agreement with the United States, deepening the already largely American presence in Hawaii. But upon the agreement's renewal in 1887, America insisted in negotiations that the U.S. Navy get exclusive rights to use an underdeveloped location as a coaling and repair station. The place, a pristine bay of several locks with lush oyster beds, would come to be called Pearl Harbor. Yet Pearl was inferior to the nearby commercial port of Honolulu Harbor, which could accept large, deep draft ships. By contrast, Pearl's entrance was shallow and mostly blocked by coral reef, with only a small entrance that had been cut by a native Hawaiian chief. And Congress didn't really want to shell out the money to develop it further. But then, in 1898, America's posture in the Pacific changed. In the wake of the Spanish-American War, a wave of empire-building politicians looked to the Pacific, no longer for commerce or conversion, but now territorial expansion.
And again, I mean, I'm not justifying or defending the U.S. doing that, but it's kind of what all the big boys were doing, right? And so if you want to be up there with the British and the Germans and the other great European powers, what are you going to do? Well, you've got to gobble up some of that territory for yourself, too.
In 1893, a group of American businessmen and Hawaiian subjects of American descent staged a coup against the Hawaiian monarchy, with the goal of annexing the islands to the United States. However, when newly inaugurated President Grover Cleveland blocked annexation, the coup planners briefly formed a republic to wait for the U.S. to elect an administration with a more expansionist mindset.
So, really interesting to see the parallels here between Hawaii and Texas. Texas gets its independence from Mexico in 1836, and immediately what are they thinking of? Becoming a part of the United States. Well, they weren't in a place where that was able to happen for another decade or so. And once it did, it leads to war, the U.S. Mexican-American War. So yeah, kind of the same thing happens here. You've got Americans who had settled in Texas, who then are a big part of Texas getting its independence against Mexico, and then start the movement to become part of the United States. Same thing happens here.
And they got what they wanted in President William McKinley. See, when the United States took over Manila Bay in 1898 as part of the Spanish-American War, it was clear to the McKinley administration that the Philippines would not be liberated, but made a territory of the United States. And needing a way station to support America's Asian territory, McKinley gladly accepted the offer of Hawaiian annexation, as well as seizing the formerly Spanish Guam and claiming Wake Island.
And so you can see how he could justify that to the American people and to the Congress, right? Well, I mean, we've got the Philippines now because of this war, and nobody's really arguing with the fact that we should have the Philippines. So now we just need some places to stop on the way there. It only makes sense, and so you're able to justify it much easier.
Within months, the U.S. had established a trans-Pacific empire with a reliable system of trade routes and way stations. Development work began at Pearl Harbor, with the Navy commencing dredging operations so it could finally accommodate large ships. And while the first dry dock collapsed in a 1913 engineering disaster, by 1919, Pearl Harbor finally became a functioning naval station. A functioning naval station that Japan looked on with unease. After all, they'd been thrust into this modern world by a visiting American fleet, and now they had the potential to have one at their doorstep.
And remember, too, that by this point, there are a lot of people of Japanese descent living in Hawaii. If you look at the census information and the stuff that's available, huge percentage of that, and it's still true today. I mean, just in terms of visitors, when I was in Pearl Harbor, there were a lot of people from Japan who were there. A lot of Japanese people go there for vacation. They have weddings there. There was a Japanese couple getting married in the hotel that we were staying in when we were there. You got to remember, it's closer to Japan than it is to the majority of the U.S. population.
Combination of Pearl Harbor and the Philippines represented a new, potentially game-changing threat, allowing the U.S. to project naval power across the Pacific and into Asia. But despite a few diplomatic incidents, things remained largely cordial between the U.S. and Japan. The two fought on the same side during World War I, with Japan further expanding its colonial possessions in the Pacific Islands, gaining a mandate over German colonies after the war. Yet that was where things started to sour. During the negotiations over the Treaty of Versailles, Japan led a push for a statement on racial equality in the treaty that the U.S. knocked down. Similarly, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, meant to limit the size of fleets to prevent another arms race and world war, constrained Japan to having only 3 capital ships for every 5 the U.S. and Britain possessed.
Isn't that convenient, right? So much like what happens in World War II, where you have thought being given to the potential rivalry with the Soviet Union and the Western allies. You have the same thing happening here with Japan over the Pacific. People are starting to see, now that Japan's opened up, now that they've intervened by becoming kind of nominally a part of World War I, now we need to make sure we kind of keep them in check. Plus, there is a racial component to this, right? There's a view in which people of European descent kind of look down on people who are East Asian like this. And, excuse me. The naval arms race is much like what we see in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s with the nuclear arms race, right? You have this kind of unchecked growth, and then finally you have the main powers coming together and saying, okay, listen, this is getting out of control for everybody. Why don't we put limits on what people can have? But then, of course, the argument is, well, how come your limit is that and my limit is that? And you can see how Japan would not like this.
While the London Naval Conference of 1930 loosened this ratio on heavy cruisers, making it 10-7, it was still rightly seen as an attempt to constrain Japanese naval power. It seriously inflamed both international relations between the two countries, as well as fueling hardline militarist parties in Japan. And in 1931, things shifted again, when Japanese officers staged the Mukden incident, using a false flag bomb attack on a rail line as a pretext to invade Chinese Manchuria. U.S. diplomats at the League of Nations attempted to stop the invasion by invoking a peace pact Japan and China had signed in 1928. Yeah, that had no effect.
And you can understand why the U.S. might feel optimistic about this. Remember, Theodore Roosevelt ends up getting the Nobel Peace Prize because of his involvement in the peace for the Russo-Japanese War. So there had always been kind of American involvement in these things, and there was no reason for the United States to believe it couldn't be involved here. But this is kind of what spells the end of the League of Nations, right? The League of Nations formed after the end of World War I, even though the United States doesn't join it because the U.S. Senate doesn't ratify it, even though it was a brainchild of you-know-who. But this is when they realized the League of Nations really isn't effective because it just has no power over stopping what's happening with Japan's invasion of China.
So, declaring that Japan's actions had voided the Washington Naval Treaty, Secretary of State Henry Stimson announced that the U.S. would no longer be bound by the arms agreement. A new naval arms race in the Pacific had begun, and its conclusion ran a straight line to 1941. Right to the U.S. Pacific Fleet languishing at Pearl Harbor, which we'll talk about next week.
All right, we're going to go ahead and dive right in to part 2. You get a 2 for today, so let's do that.
Yangtze River, December 12th, 1937. The Japanese dive bomber lets its payload go. The bomb smashing into the bow of U.S. Navy vessel USS Panay as sailors run to stations in disbelief. The U.S. and Japan are not at war. Part of the U.S. Navy's Asiatic Squadron, Panay is steaming away from the Chinese nationalist capital of Nanking, where it had evacuated civilians just before the city fell to the Japanese army. Now, it's escorting 3 standard oil tankers away from the burning city, fleeing reports of mass murder. Sailors run to shelter. One, still in his underwear, sprays machine gun fire at the fighters straight.
Remember what city we're talking about here, Nanking. It's, hearing reports of mass murder is an understatement. This is definitely a place where these kinds of things are going on, and they're trying to evacuate Americans out of this situation because the United States is neutral. And this is one of those incidents that could have been like a Lusitania type of thing, right? But diplomacy is able to temper things in this case.
Strafing the vessel. The captain is grievously wounded, and the vessel's second officer takes command, though moments later, shrapnel rips open his throat. He can't speak to issue orders, so he writes it on the bulkhead with his own blood. Abandoned ship. Thanks so much to World Anvil for helping us forge today's historical tale. It's December 18th, and in Tokyo, U.S. Ambassador to Japan Joseph Grew is trying to prevent a war. Accords signed after the Boxer Rebellion had allowed U.S. Navy gunboats like the USS Panay to patrol Chinese rivers and protect American commerce. To attack one violated international law, and the details did not look good. Japanese planes had sunk the Panay, along with the 3 standard oil tanker ships, killing 3 Americans and wounding 48. They'd even machine-gunned the lifeboats. This despite the fact that the Panay had radioed its position to Japanese forces and marked itself with 3 large American flags. In the U.S., the public...
Yeah, it's kind of hard to argue that it was a mistake in that case. I can understand radioing the position. Maybe that information doesn't make it to fighter pilots, but the American flag should have been a pretty strong giveaway. But this kind of stuff happens, right? I mean, look at what happens during the pursuit of the Bismarck, where you have British planes actually firing torpedoes at one of their own ships. So you would think that this kind of stuff wouldn't happen, but in the fog of war and the chaos and the confusion of fighting, sometimes this stuff happens.
Mood was one of indignation. While there was also anger at Japan for what was being called the Rape of Nanking, the public treated the attack on the Panay as an even worse affront, particularly because they saw it firsthand. Most of the evacuees from Nanking had been journalists, and one filmed the attack from the Panay's deck. Ambassador Grew worried that, if it escalates, this incident could lead to war. It felt like the USS Maine all over again, especially since Grew's boss, President Franklin Roosevelt, was far more willing than his predecessors to confront what he privately called the bandit nations.
Axis of evil, right? I mean, this is a thing that George W. Bush uses in the first decade of this century. When you start to identify who your potential rivals are, the process begins pretty early of creating a narrative and of making a description to the public that's going to work. The same thing happened in World War I, right? As soon as the war breaks out, the propaganda fight is also taking place, and describing the German soldiers with those Pickelhaube helmets that have the pointy thing on the top, and talking about the terrible atrocities they commit in Belgium. And you want to do everything you can to make clear lines of bad guy and good guy, even if they don't exist. In this case, they do, but
of Germany, Japan, and Italy. In October, Roosevelt had even given a speech calling for a quarantine of aggressive nations, arguing that America should take an active hand in containing the epidemic of world lawlessness. But Roosevelt had suffered such an isolationist backlash against that speech that even he hoped to defuse the Panay situation as quickly as possible. So, Grew reached out to contacts in Japan's civilian government and business community, as well as retired Admiral Nomura, who was connected to foreign policy circles. But no one seemed to know why the Panay had been attacked. Some said it was a mistake, while others said it might be a plot by low-level Japanese officers to scare American forces out of China. American radio intercepts suggested it was intentional. But Grew also found Japanese leaders receptive to his demand for an apology.
It could be both at the same time, right? It could be intentional by people on the ground there, but then the higher-ups in Japan are horrified that that would happen and doing everything they can to avoid this escalating. Both could be true at the same time.
Japan's government and public were mortified over the incident, and within days, the American embassy in Tokyo was besieged by letters of apology from Japanese citizens, including school children, along with envelopes stuffed with yen for the victims. Wow. On December 23rd, a Japanese delegation arrives at the U.S. Embassy to meet with Grew. They take full responsibility and designate a high-ranking naval officer to present a formal apology. In addition, they'll pay an indemnity of over $2 million to compensate the United States for the Panay and the 3 tankers.
And so you can see here why this de-escalates the situation, right? You have a choice when this happens. You can double down. You can say, well, we're defending our people. We did nothing wrong. They were in a war zone. Or you can say, you know what? We screwed up bad. People got killed. And we're sorry. And we're going to do everything we can to make it right. So Japan handles this really, really well.
Yet they maintain that the attack was a case of misidentification. A pretty ludicrous position given the facts. But if it prevents a war, then it's a compromise Crew and Roosevelt are willing to make.
And so for the Americans' side of things, what do you have to do to keep this from escalating? Well, you could push and you could say, no, this was intentional, and here's our proof. Or you can say, okay, you know what? We know it was intentional, but we're not going to gain anything by pushing that narrative. We need to bring down the escalation a little bit, and so you're going to compromise.
The apology arrives in Washington on Christmas Day, the fury over the attack diffused by the holiday season. In Tokyo, Japanese diplomats breathe a sigh of relief. For as much as Crew and Roosevelt want to avoid war, the Japanese government can't afford more complications in its Chinese quagmire. Despite early victories, it was becoming clear that in invading China, Japan had bitten off more than it could chew. The central government hadn't planned or even formally declared this war. It was capitulated into it by the actions of mid-level army officers, and there was no overall strategic plan or even an obvious goal. Instead, there were nebulous assertions about northern expansion and seizing resources, but the truth was, it was costing far more resources than it brought in, and the army's brazen massacres, like at Nanking, were wrecking Japanese diplomatic efforts, which was dangerous.
And yeah, there's a parallel here between this and the German invasion of the Soviet Union, right? You know, the argument being, well, they had to have the oil. They had to have those oil fields in the Caucasus, but they end up using way more oil in launching the invasion and having to fight this costly war and not only losing resources, but millions of troops than they would have if they'd just stayed at peace with them in the first place. So sometimes the goal that you have in a war ends up being the very thing that hurts you in the end.
Because the Chinese theater was a mess of international forces, none of which Japan could afford to antagonize. First, there were American and British river gunboats like Panay, literally sailing through the conflict. Then Germany was present too. Despite being part of an anti-communist pact with Japan, it sold the Chinese nationalists equipment and provided military advisors. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, wanting to support Mao's communists, had sent Soviet planes and pilots to shore up China's weak air forces and bomb Japanese bases. Which was double scary, since that risked Japan's greatest fear: war with the Soviet Union.
Yep.
And then there was the United States itself, which was playing both sides. Popular sympathy in the US lay solidly with China, seeing it as a victim of Japanese aggression, and the US government supported the nationalist cause with supplies routed through French Indochina. Yet, paradoxically, America also supplied Japan with the high-grade fuel oil Japanese...
And there you have the reason that we end up at war. Oil.
ships and planes used to pound nationalist forces. Any one of these powers risked getting dragged into the conflict. And despite what some militarist fanatics insisted, Japan could not simultaneously fight both a Western power and China.
Right.
A thing that only became more clear as 1938 and 1939 dragged on, and Japan and China cut negotiations. Now it seemed the only path Japan had for victory was to conquer China. Japanese forces kept advancing, but now it was clear that nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek was intentionally giving up territory, using the vastness of his country against them, so they had to commit more resources into holding it.
This is what you do when you're a weaker nation against a more powerful one, especially when you're China and you've got a lot of manpower, but maybe not the resources to fight toe-to-toe with them. This is what the Americans did against the British during the Revolutionary War, is, fall back, kind of a war of attrition. Make them expend so much money and time and resources and manpower that eventually they can't do it. That's what the Texans did against Mexico in their war for independence. They call it the runaway scrape. Fall back until you find an opportunity.
And while the Japanese army was spread increasingly thin, they also had to deal with Maoist guerrillas, which sabotaged coal mines and other resources. Then, in July 1939, the most terrifying thing of all occurred. A group of militarist officers posted near the border with Mongolia made an unsanctioned border incursion against the Soviets, hoping to trigger a conflict that would let Japan seize Siberia. Instead, the Soviets encircled and smashed the Japanese forces, making planners question whether Japan could truly stand up to the full might of a Western power. Japanese diplomats, including Admiral Nomura, hastily concluded the conflict by recognizing the Soviet view of border claims. But it wasn't even a month before yet another diplomatic crisis gripped Tokyo, when Germany and the Soviet Union announced a non-aggression pact. Now, that was, as geopolitical scholars term it, a real dick move. The anti-communist treaty was supposed to align Japan and Germany against the Soviets. And now, without even telling Japan, Germany had concluded an agreement that gave the USSR peace on its western border, which meant that the Soviets could, theoretically, turn all their attention toward invading Manchuria and Japan.
So if you're Japan, you're feeling increasingly isolated at this point. And when people get isolated, they get backed into a corner. That's when they start to act in a more extreme way, in a more aggressive way, in a more unwise way sometimes.
Y'all, I'm starting to feel like this Hitler guy might be a little untrustworthy. Meanwhile, shipments of American aircraft parts were suddenly drying up. It turned out that Roosevelt, while not making any public announcement, had privately requested American aircraft manufacturers to stop selling to Japan. Then, in July of 1939, Roosevelt escalated by canceling America's commercial treaty with Japan, effective
Isolation.
January 1940. Not only would this be a commercial hit, but it removed the legal protections against the United States declaring an embargo. What would happen? Japanese officials began to ask if he shut off our oil. Yet in that dark period, a window of opportunity opened. Germany invaded Poland in 1939, plunging Europe into war, and by June 1940, had swept across France and the Netherlands. So while Japan's northern expansion strategy favored by...
Is Belgium just chopped liver in this situation? We're not going to mention Belgium. I get why we're not mentioning Belgium, because they don't have any territory in the Pacific at this point, but...
The army had clearly failed. Because China was a quagmire and the Soviets too dangerous, the Imperial Japanese Navy's rival strategy of striking down into Southeast Asia to seize the rubber-producing regions of British Malaya and the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies was now suddenly possible.
So, and what do you have here? You have French Indochina, you have British, you have Dutch territories. These are all countries that Germany is at war with.
With the English, French, and Dutch busy fighting Germany, they wouldn't be reinforcing their positions halfway around the world. So for a brief time, the colonies of Asia appeared up for grabs. Japan could sweep in fast, just as Germany had overrun France. But that window might not be open for long. Heck, Germany itself might snap them up. The rallying cry, "Don't miss the bus!" echoed throughout the government, capturing the feeling of escalation and frantic activity. Japan's first step, it was decided, would be to move into French Indochina and cut the Western supply lines to nationalist China. And so as Nomura took a ship for Washington as his country's new ambassador, and Roosevelt mulled more sanctions, Japan drew up troops on the border with French Indochina, preparing for its third undeclared war in 3 years. A war that would put it on a collision course with the United States.
All right, we're going to wrap it up right there. That's the first 2 episodes. There's more to come. And when they release the next episode, we will definitely dive into that one as well. My latest episode from the battlefields in and around the town of Ypres, Belgium is out. I'm going to throw up the link to that. Please check that out. I'm very proud of how the series is coming out so far. I hope you'll take the time to watch that one. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to part 3 of our look at The Path to Pearl Harbor by Extra History. After we get through part 4 tomorrow, I will be taking a break from Extra History so we can move on to some other content you can be watching very soon for a video about upcoming content in the next couple of weeks and a look ahead to next year. So I'm excited about some of the things we're going to be doing. We're going to go ahead and dive into this. There's a link in the description to the original content and also to my reaction to part 1 if you missed the first 2 episodes of this. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Hanoi, September 22nd, 1940, 2000 hours. General Maurice Martin, commander of French forces in Indochina, sits in a humid meeting room with a general of the Imperial Japanese Army.
So French Indochina, if you know where Vietnam is a part of French Indochina. It's that part of Asia that the French have colonized.
They're working under a deadline, for in 2 hours, Japan will invade. This had started in June, just after France fell, with a demand from Foreign Minister Matsuoka to cease shipments across the border to China and allow Japanese border observers. But as the months dragged on, the ultimatum has increased. Now, Japan wants the border totally closed and to station troops, ships, and warplanes in northern French Indochina.
So this is interesting because you don't really think too much or hear too much about what's happening with the French after they fall to Germany. So Germany invades in May 1940. France falls pretty quickly. They occupy a good chunk of France, but a big part of it, especially the central and southeast part of France, is under the Vichy government, which is a collaboration government. It's a pro-Germany government of the French, so that Germany doesn't have to waste manpower occupying the entire country. But France still has these colonies all over the place, which now, at least in theory, are under a government that should be pro-German and therefore also pro-Japan. But it doesn't seem like that's the case.
It's egregious, but Martin has little choice. The Japanese 22nd Army is ready to cross the border at 2200 hours. He makes a counteroffer. How about 6,000 Japanese troops, not 25,000? The general agrees. Whew. An hour before the deadline, word goes out that an agreement has been reached. But when the deadline comes, the 22nd Army invades anyway. Thanks so much to Ground News for sponsoring today's historical tale. Japanese diplomats hadn't expected the Indochina operation to go like that. Theoretically, this was supposed to be part of a diplomatic expansion south, one that was to be accomplished amicably through negotiation.
And in theory, you would think that that would be a big deal for the Japanese, right? Because they've been at war for a couple of years now in the Pacific, in Eastern Asia. So anything they can accomplish diplomatically and avoid being at war with another country, or be able to avoid their troops having to get involved somewhere else, you're going to try to do that.
After all, Japan was Germany's ally, and Germany now controlled France. I mean, why wouldn't France just let them in? But again, at this point, Japanese diplomats weren't really running the show. Rather, militarists in the cabinet were directing foreign policy now. And
we talked about that in the series we just did about Japanese militarism, right? Where the civilian authorities in Japan really are not authorities at all. They're beholden to the military. And even within the military, you've got conflict between the Army and the Navy for influence and supremacy and to dictate what happens next. And the civilians are they're just basically powerless.
And though Foreign Minister Matsuoka, a man who'd led Japan's exit from the League of Nations, was himself a militarist, even he still had limited power. The military considered the civilian foreign ministry unreliable and rarely shared their plans with Matsuoka or his subordinates. I mean, they'd sent a general to negotiate in Hanoi, not an ambassador. Meanwhile, low-level military officers were provoking conflicts again, like launching a needless invasion of French Indochina, despite receiving word of a diplomatic solution. And to be clear, we're not talking about a small border skirmish here. We're talking a multi-day undeclared war with tank formations and amphibious assaults. Now, a few months later, the Foreign Ministry did successfully act as a mediator to end a short war between Thailand and French Indochina, but that didn't really change.
And so French Indochina, if you think of this being like kind of almost like a giant peninsula, French Indochina is the east, Thailand's on the west.
Japan's image as a military aggressor, and at the White House, Roosevelt most certainly still felt that way. Over that chaotic summer of 1940, he'd been taking all the actions he could, pitching them as defensive in order to avoid backlash from isolationists. In May, he'd stationed the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, where it could credibly threaten Japan should it try to move south.
So if you're Roosevelt in this situation, Roosevelt he's been talking to, the British government, for example. The Brits have been our allies going back to World War I, and the French as well. And he knows, for example, Britain's standing alone in all of this. Roosevelt's been president for 6 and a half years when World War II breaks out in 1939. But he knows that he's got an isolationist government at home. He doesn't have the political support to be able to get involved in the war directly. So he finds ways to get involved, right? Selling weapons and supplies and things like that to the Allies, positioning the fleet in Pearl Harbor, building things up, reinstituting the draft, things like that, to kind of start helping get the U.S. on a footing to where it won't be completely caught off guard if and when we do end up at war.
A move the Navy disliked, since it split their fleet and kept it far from its home base. He'd also made diplomatic and congressional moves on what would eventually become the Lend-Lease program, which you can watch our video about here, supplying the UK and other not-quite allies with old military equipment.
That's, Lend-Lease. Again, just like in World War I, U.S. is technically militarily neutral, but not neutral in terms of the supplies and the help that is being given.
And after the fall of France, he'd pushed a bill through Congress known as the Two-Ocean Navy Act, expanding the U.S. Navy fleet size by 75%. Not only would this allow the U.S. to simultaneously fight a war in both the Atlantic and Pacific, the expansion focused on aircraft carriers and naval aviation, modernizing a badly aging fleet.
And this is super important that this happens before the U.S. gets involved in World War II, because these ships take years sometimes to build. It's not like you're pumping out a battleship in 2 weeks or an aircraft carrier. You've got to be planning ahead. And so the fact that the U.S. starts this ball rolling before getting involved in war is probably what saves us in the Pacific from what could have been a disaster.
In September, he reinstated the military draft, and he began efforts to harden American defenses in the Philippines and Guam, and transform the civilian airstrips on Midway and Wake Islands into Navy air bases. America would not seek a war, the reasoning went, but given the march of German and Japanese aggression, it needed to be ready to fight one. But after the aggression in Indochina, Roosevelt wanted to directly target the Japanese military. So, he expanded the embargoes of the Export Act to also cover iron and steel scrap, metals crucial for war production.
So think about this for a second, because, we talk about alternate history sometimes, and I know some people don't like that, but the reason I do is because exploring alternate history allows us to take a kind of a micro look at certain events and their importance by kind of gaming out what would have happened if this decision or this event had gone a different way, thereby seeing how important it was. So, for example, we could say here, well, what if the military did listen and did stand down and did not send those 20+ thousand troops into French Indochina? Does Roosevelt have the backing to expand these embargoes? And if he doesn't, and these embargoes don't happen, do we end up at war in December 1941?
In response, the Japanese ambassador in Washington met with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, calling the metal embargo an unfriendly act. The United States was intervening in diplomatic negotiations between allies, he said, where it simply had no part. Besides, Japan was merely trying to stop illegal weapons shipments to the corrupt nationalist regime in China. But Hull knew that argument was a smokescreen, because a U.S. military program known as Magic had secretly broken Japan's new diplomatic cipher, Purple. While the decryptions weren't total, and many of the messages were difficult to understand due to code words and poor translations, one thing was clear. The moves in Indochina were part of an expansion south.
Never, ever, ever underestimate the importance, especially in World War II, of cryptography, of breaking codes and being able to decrypt things, breaking codes, but also keeping the enemy from reading your codes. Time and time and time again, we see the importance of this, of using deception, but also breaking through the enemy's deception and understanding what he's doing. So important in this war.
Yet relations did briefly improve. In November, that ambassador was recalled and replaced with the genial Admiral Nomura, who immediately bonded with Roosevelt over their shared interest in naval matters.
Yeah, remember, Roosevelt was once the Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
Furthermore, Hull and Nomura got along well, meeting regularly at Hull's apartment, where they could be more candid, and Nomura always kept an even temper, even when the two clashed, believing to his core that a conflict would be bad for both countries. But what Hull and even Nomura didn't realize was exactly how much Roosevelt's attempt at deterrence was in fact driving Japan closer to war with the United States. In Tokyo, military and civilian leaders were terrified over Roosevelt's expansion of naval power, because this wasn't just the US leaving behind the naval treaties of the 20s and 30s.
Which everybody was doing by this point.
This meant new American carriers, destroyers, cruisers, and airplanes coming off the production line every year for the next 5 years. Currently, the US and Japan had roughly equal navies, with Japan having a slight advantage in merchant vessels, but now that America was on a war-producing footing, that might only last a year or two. So an argument started to circulate. If a war was inevitable, why not fight it soon? After all, every day Japan waited, the US Navy was getting larger, and if Roosevelt cut their oil, the opposite would be true. Each day of non-combat operations would mean Japan had less fuel to fight.
It's interesting how both world wars, the decisions of the nations that end up being the enemies of the United States, for example, how some of the decisions they make that end up dooming themselves are in part because of the potential of the United States, not even the actual power of the United States. World War I, Germany launches this Kaiserschlacht offensive in the spring offensive of 1918, which basically destroys their ability to fight the war on the Western Front at that point, because they know that every day the American army is getting bigger and bigger and eventually is going to become a force on the Western Front in World War I. So it's not about the actual presence of the Americans, but the eventual presence of the Americans. Same thing here. Japan's looking at this and they're thinking, you know what, we can't win a long-term war against the United States, but the best chance we have is to hit them now before all of these new aircraft carriers and naval vessels come off the line and they get even more powerful. So we've got to hit them now and hope for the best.
Japan's attempt to manufacture synthetic oil had failed, and when they made import deals with Mexico, the US leaned on its southern neighbor to get those canceled. Foreign Minister Matsuoka, however, had a solution. Deter U.S. action by signing a tripartite pact with Europe's totalitarian states of Germany and Italy. Nazi diplomat von Ribbentrop had first suggested such a thing as early as 1938, and to Matsuoka, it made immediate sense. Germany was one of the few nations to recognize Japan's Manchurian puppet state. All three wanted to deter the U.S. from joining the war, and by signaling a mutual defense pact, it meant America would need to fight a two-ocean conflict. Germany also pledged that the Pacific would be Japan's sphere of influence. Matsuoka's concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The idea that Japan would throw Western colonialists out of Asia and lead the region to prosperity. Though it should be noted, not everyone was on board with a Nazi alliance. In Tokyo, one colleague warned that Hitler was untrustworthy and routinely violated treaties. After all, Hitler had already broken his anti-communist pact with Japan by signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin, and he hadn't even bothered to inform Tokyo in advance.
Yeah, so, it's important for us to recognize that when we talk about Japan and Germany, we can't talk about them the same way, for example, that we talk about England in the United States or the United Kingdom in the United States. They're not on that level of an alliance. They're not actively supporting and helping one another. They're basically just saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend is what this is. And they're still going to put their own interests ahead of everybody else, including their so-called allies. It's very, very different than what we see with the Western allies.
An alliance hadn't helped them in Indochina after all, and once the pact was signed, Matsuoka had to issue embarrassing statements saying Japan wouldn't be adopting Germany's anti-Semitic policies. But Matsuoka remained committed to the alliance, especially because he believed the Soviets could be enticed to join, forming a bloc of totalitarian nations to challenge the Western democracies. And in 1940, the alliance bore fruit. November 11th, 1940, 250 miles southwest of Sumatra. Officers of the German commerce raider Atlantis board the merchant vessel. They'd come upon it disguised as a fellow merchant ship, then fired at the bridge at close range, killing most of the command. Now they're taking passengers and crew aboard their own ship before scuttling it. But then, one of the passengers asks an officer if they could go get her family's tea set in the ship's vault. And when he agrees and goes to retrieve it, the officer finds more than just porcelain. 15 bags of top-secret mail destined for the British Far East Command.
Oops.
There are maps, decoders, intelligence reports, and a special bag filled with holes so it would sink when thrown overboard. Documents inside detail Britain's plans for the defense of Singapore, troop strength in the region, and how the colonies would fight a potential war. The assessment is grim. Currently, Britain cannot win a fight with Japan. All 15 bags were forwarded to Tokyo, their reception causing a massive stir. The Strike South plan was not only feasible, it should begin soon. But wait, what of the American fleet at Pearl Harbor? If Japan took...
So here's another one of those moments, right? We were just talking about those moments history could have gone differently. What if this lady doesn't say, can you go back for my tea? What if this guy doesn't find this stuff? Does this have that significant of an impact on Japanese strategy in the Pacific?
Took the Dutch East Indies, it would surely respond. Yet a group of naval officers felt otherwise, arguing that the U.S. fleet could be preemptively destroyed at the commencement of hostilities, giving Japan a year or two to consolidate its wins in Southeast Asia before having to fight the Americans in earnest. It was worth developing a contingency plan. After all, in November, the British had used a fleet of carrier-launched torpedo bombers to raid an Italian port. They should get someone to study that possibility. Lucky for them, one man was eager for the assignment. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto.
Yep.
Oh man, Zoe.
Yamamoto, who went to Harvard, and so he knew his opponents, he knew the Americans well. So I'm excited to dive back into this tomorrow with part 4. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, as we continue the path to Pearl Harbor. This is episode 4 from Extra History. If you haven't seen the first 3 episodes of my reaction, there's a link that'll take you back to episodes 1 and 2, which were in one video. That you can check that out and get all caught up. I've also put the link in the description for the original content if you want to check it out without my commentary, as well as all of their other fantastic history content. Here we go.
Honolulu, Hawaii, April 12th, 1941. Tadashi Morimura, the new vice consul at Japan's consulate general in Honolulu, is unusually daring for a civil servant. A private pilot, he rents small aircraft to fly around the island and swims the southern waterways. He also visits the geisha bars favored by local Japanese and visiting naval officers and loves chatting up the girls for gossip. And he lives unusually far away from work, 8 miles to be precise, in a second-floor apartment overlooking Pearl Harbor. Now, if that all sounds odd to you, there's a good reason. Because that identity is a cover. In reality, he's Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa of Imperial Japanese Naval Intelligence, a specialist in U.S. Navy warships.
So we talked last episode, and I talk about it all the time, about the incredible importance of intelligence gathering, of decryption, of all of that sort of thing throughout the Second World War. There's probably never been a war in human history where that played such a role. And we see this perfect example of that. And you see this kind of portrayed a little bit if you've ever seen the movie Tora, 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 which is fantastic, by the way. Definitely worth checking out, which shows the build-up to and the events that unfolded on December 7th, 1941. And this gives you a little bit of a background into some of the justification that is used for the internment of Japanese Americans. I am not in any way justifying it. I'm just trying to help us understand the mindset that was involved in making that decision when you have things like this happening. And listen, let's be honest, there's a racial component to this as well. And there was a fear that this kind of stuff was going to continue throughout the war. And so they're trying to round up anybody that they think might do something similar to what this guy did.
His job is to provide descriptions of the harbor and monitor which vessels are in port. And he reports this information back to Tokyo via diplomatic cables. Cables that, he has no way of knowing, are being read by the American military. The countdown has started. Thanks so much to NordVPN for helping to keep us safe on the internet. For a 2-year plan on a huge discount, use code ExtraCreditsVPN at nordvpn.com/ExtraCreditsVPN. April 13th, 1941. A train station in Moscow. Foreign Minister Matsuoka and the Japanese delegation are in high spirits. They're slapping backs, hugging, many of them a little intoxicated after a celebration banquet. For half a century, Japan has feared an attack by Russia, but no more. Over the last several months, Matsuoka has been negotiating a non-aggression pact between Japan and the Soviet Union, and today they signed it. And as the conversation on the platform dwindles, Matsuoka turns to see an unbelievable sight. Walking through the crowd is Stalin himself.
Crazy. So, we talk a lot about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is the one that was signed between Germany and the Soviet Union, but this one's a little lesser known, and this one actually holds a lot longer. It's only a couple of months after the end of the war in Europe in 1945 that the Soviet Union eventually breaks this completely and declares war on Japan.
Come to see Matsuoka off. This never happens. Stalin doesn't go to the train station to give diplomats a personal farewell. And it's at that moment that Matsuoka feels the weight of history, and how badly the Soviets wanted this arrangement. Now, Stalin can withdraw troops from its border with occupied Manchuria and send them west, and Japan, for its part, could remove their own troops and push south.
So one might argue here that in some ways, this non-aggression pact that Japan makes with the Soviet Union actually hurts Germany, because now this frees up troops that otherwise would have been meant to stay on the Manchurian border, and now they can be sent west where they'll be available against Germany in that war.
But when Matsuoka arrives back in Tokyo, he found that plan had become a bit more complicated. For in Washington, Ambassador Nomura had hashed out a draft resolution that could normalize relations with the U.S. If Japan would agree to withdraw troops from China, merge its Chinese puppet state government with Chiang's nationalist government, and pledge to recognize Chinese independence, the United States was prepared to recognize Manchuria as a Japanese possession, normalize trade, and end racially discriminatory immigration laws.
This looks like a really good deal when you consider that the alternative is that Japan ends up fighting and losing a costly war with the United States and the other Western allies. Seems like a good idea, but again, if you're militaristic and you're all about expansion and taking resources and that becomes who you are, it's very difficult to say, now we're going to step back from that, we're going to withdraw troops from lands that we've conquered, we're going to not worry about expanding further. The militarists are not going to go for this.
And Prime Minister Konoye was considering it. After all, he wanted out of the Chinese quagmire. And while it might come off as a betrayal of the Japanese soldiers who died in China, it could prevent thousands more from dying in a Pacific-wide conflict. Matsuoka was livid. He insisted that the draft be shown to their German allies and said that the time to attack British Singapore had come. After all, he'd spent over a year forging diplomatic agreements with Germany and the Soviets to keep the pressure off Japan. And what, now they were just gonna give in? Matsuoka started to go rogue. He made a counteroffer where Japan gave up nothing and started to denigrate Konoye in public. Worse still, once Nazi Germany broke its non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union in late June, he insisted that Japan should abandon the Southern Strike and instead invade the USSR in support. Konoye, deeply embarrassed, had to personally apologize to the emperor for Matsuoka's conduct and give assurances he did not plan to provoke a war with Stalin. In fact, the fiery diplomat's presence had even become a sticking point in negotiations, with Secretary of State Cordell Hull suggesting that talks could not go forward with Matsuoka still in government.
That's a real problem when you've got that extreme of a stance saying, listen, you've got to replace this guy or we have nothing more to talk about. I mean, that's you don't see that happen a lot of times in history, especially after the guy has just negotiated what on the surface seems like a really favorable deal for his country.
He also demanded that Japan quit the Tripartite Pact. And when Matsuoka started to act without consulting the cabinet, Konoye decided it was time for him to go. So his ministers dissolved the cabinet and reformed it without him. In Washington, Roosevelt and Hull were overjoyed. With Matsuoka out, perhaps this signaled a cooling off of military aggression. Their hope was misplaced. 4 days later, under the threat of military action, Japan had reached an agreement to occupy the southern portion of French Indochina, moving into air bases that would allow them to bomb British Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines.
So much of the Pacific War, not only at this point, but throughout the entire war, because of all these islands and because of the range that's available, at least at the start of the war for these bombers and these fighters, and the range of your Navy, for that matter, is all about island hopping. It's all about getting access, right? Every move that is made is with the next 3 or 4 moves in mind. It's a chess game, right? In chess, you're not just thinking about that move. You're thinking about what's the enemy going to do when I make this move, and then what's my response going to be. And you have to think several moves ahead. The whole Pacific War is all about that.
The air bases that would allow them to bomb British Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. A hard response was needed, and Roosevelt delivered. He announced he would formally cut relations, put an embargo on goods, and freeze all Japanese assets in the United States.
Think about how quickly this devolves, this situation. You go from a negotiated settlement where the U.S. is going to actually recognize some of the territory Japan has taken. If Japan will back off and not do any further aggressive moves, and give up some of the ground that they've taken. You have all of the trade deals settled, all of that's in place, but now we've gone off the other end, and now we're not even going to have diplomatic relations anymore. I mean, that's usually the last step before war.
With that last measure cutting all American oil sales to Japan. Yet days later, he gave Nomura a new offer. Pull out of Indochina and make it a neutral territory, and the assets would be unfrozen. See, the U.S. oil embargo wasn't a full embargo. That would leave Roosevelt without much flexibility in negotiations. Japan obtained American oil by buying licenses to purchase a certain volume, and Japan had already obtained enough licenses to keep them supplied until 1943. But that oil had to be paid with U.S. currency held in American banks, and those were the assets that were frozen. Though, technically, the Treasury Department could decide on a case-by-case basis to allow Japan's license purchases to go through. So Roosevelt could, essentially, loosen or tighten Japan's supply of oil in a carrot-and-stick approach.
It's actually pretty smart diplomacy here. You don't back yourself into a corner. You don't paint yourself into a situation where you've really got no options. He's leaving all the options on the table. He's given himself maximum flexibility to get harsher or looser depending on what Japan decides to do. So he's really putting the ball in Japan's court here.
Nomura didn't even pass on the proposal to Tokyo, knowing that the militarists, especially Minister of War Hideki Tojo, had boxed Prime Minister Konoye in. On August 1st, the economic measures went into effect. Yet Roosevelt's measured approach was not followed. As he took a 2-week diplomatic visit to meet Churchill, the Treasury went hardline and denied all Japanese oil purchases.
And you have to keep in mind, too, this is August. By August, Japan is already hard at work on the plan for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? So it's not like this all went south and then Japan just kind of on a whim decided to bomb Pearl Harbor. They've been working on this the whole time as kind of the last resort if all of this doesn't play out.
Then, given the popularity of this tough stance among friendly nations, Roosevelt retroactively endorsed it. What he didn't endorse, however, was coming to those nations' defense. All summer, British and Dutch diplomats had tried to get Roosevelt to commit, even informally, to fight together should Japan attack in Southeast Asia. American diplomats instead ducked, saying negotiations with Japan were ongoing and the time was not right. In truth, Roosevelt was unsure that the isolationist American public would support him going to war, even if Japan attacked. Would American parents, he wondered, accept their sons dying just to hold on to the Philippines or preserve British control of Singapore? At the time, probably not. But Roosevelt's attempt at deterring war again did the opposite. Now Japan was on the clock, with over 90% of its oil obtained from the U.S. If war was coming, every day they waited to strike south, they would have less fuel to operate with. Under wartime consumption patterns, they predicted they could only keep their ships moving and planes flying for a year. So, their options now were to either pull out of China, which the army wouldn't accept, or strike south. And
so you can see they're in an impossible situation that they themselves have put themselves into. But sometimes, think about it, this happens in life, right? We sometimes find ourselves with two choices and they're both terrible. And we're left with those two terrible choices because of many choices that we've made leading up to that. And so it, on the surface, seems like, man, I had no choice. Both choices were bad, so I chose the one that was better for me. But the reality is, well, you made a lot of choices in the last couple of years that put you in that position. So on one hand, you could look at this and say, boy, Japan was between a rock and a hard place. What choice did they have? Well, they had a lot of choices in the last year or two before this that they could have taken.
And yet, American negotiators dawdled. They were in no hurry, each day seeming as if their hand in a potential war grew stronger. Over the next several months, Prime Minister Konoye tried desperately to find a middle ground, including brokering a face-to-face meeting with Roosevelt in Alaska. Meanwhile, the planning for the strike south, with an optional attack on Pearl Harbor, advanced. The plan had gained formal approval as a contingency should negotiations fail, but militarists increasingly found that Emperor Hirohito did in fact favor a diplomatic solution.
And if you're a militarist and you feel your only option is to strike first, then you're going to paint this as much as possible as, well, we have no other choice. We have to do this. We do that in life too. When we feel like our way is the only way, we're going to sell that however we can, and we're going to make it look like any other option is just doomed to fail.
At a meeting on September 6, 1941, a militarist officer told Hirohito that a war with the United States would be over in 3 months. Not believing this, the emperor pushed back, saying that they'd said the same thing about China. China is big, explained the officer. Bigger than the Pacific? The emperor responded. And he finished the meeting by reading a poem his grandfather, Emperor Meiji, had written on the eve of the Russo-Japanese War. A poem about how the sea linked all nations and should be at peace. But he did give his assent to war if diplomacy failed. And as the weeks dragged on without progress, and the Alaska summit looked doubtful, pressures began to mount. And at a conference on September 25th, Minister of War Tojo pushed for an internal deadline. If no diplomatic options were reached by mid-October, Japan must put in motion plans for a military solution. It was agreed. Fleets began to gather and make ready. October 12th, 1941, near Mount Fuji. Konoye has brought the biggest figures in government to his private estate for a last-ditch effort to prevent war. There, he leans on Tojo, saying that he's not confident a war with the United States can be won, and that he's not equipped to lead the country through it.
I get a lot of echoes. You know, we talk all the time about history. It doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And there's some rhyming here between how the Pacific War goes down and some of the things that happened leading up to the First World War. You've got the civilian government, the diplomats trying to come up with a diplomatic solution, and their biggest enemy in coming up with a diplomatic solution being their own military, who sees this as one of those things where we have to do this, we have no choice, it's us or them kind of thing. And one of the main reasons why World War I happens is because diplomacy fails in light of the military leaders saying, well, we have to get there before they get there, so we've got to make the first move, and that means that diplomacy can't continue. Oh, man.
He threatens to resign. He also enlists allies from the Navy who privately oppose the war and think that defeat is likely, but who are also not brave enough to make their anti-war views known amongst their colleagues. The best he can get from them in the moment is to say that setting a deadline was a mistake and that they'd asked for imperial approval of the strike too early. Tojo will not budge. The sticking point is what it's always been. The army refuses to pull troops out of China. Not only does Tojo see doing this as betraying the dead, but much of the army's political power is wrapped up in the war. After many contentious hours, the meeting breaks up. And 4 days later, Konoye resigns from his post, and the emperor appoints his successor, Hideki Tojo, who tells Admiral Yamamoto to begin preparing his strike force for war.
Oh, boy. Yeah, knowing what happens, obviously, there's a lot of sense of dread involved in this, but this is good. Good stuff, again, in how they're telling the story. They do such a great job with this. You hear me say that all the time. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we will be back tomorrow with something not extra history while we wait for part 5 to come out this weekend. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone. It's been an interesting couple of days. Our internet here at our home went down on Thursday. And with the Christmas holiday and everything, they couldn't get anybody out here to fix it. There was something wrong with the line. So it's now Monday afternoon, the day after Christmas, and we just got the internet back up. So it's been an interesting couple of days in our home, which relies very heavily on access to the internet, including me being able to upload videos. So we're back now, and I'm ready to dive back in. So we're going to hit part 5 of The Path to Pearl Harbor, which is now out. If you did not see the first 4 parts of my reaction to this series from Extra History, there's a link in the description to take you back to episode 1. Same goes for a link to the original content if you want to watch it without my commentary, which I highly recommend that you do, and support Extra History for their fantastic historical content. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Tokyo, November 5th, 1941, midnight. Saburo Kurusu quietly sits on his bed. Despite his caution, his wife Alice, an American who Kurusu met on assignment there, wakes. "I'm going to the United States, probably," Kurusu says. "When?" replies Alice. "Morning." He explains that American Ambassador Grew has called in a favor to delay a Pan Am flight out of Hong Kong so Kurusu could make it via naval plane. He is to be a special envoy, delivering a peace proposal to Roosevelt. It's cold. Alice wraps a blanket around him.
So let's talk context here, right? November 5th. So this is almost a month to the day before the Pearl Harbor attack. It means it's probably within a week or two before the Navy's going to have to be leaving to head out on their attack against Pearl Harbor. So the plans for the attack on Pearl Harbor are well in place at this point. And again, we've talked throughout this series about the disconnect between the military leadership and the civilian leadership. And so I believe with all my heart, this guy probably had very good intentions, but he also probably recognized that as a part of the civilian government, he was really powerless to stop what was coming, if he even knew what was coming.
This mission will be a dangerous one. Militarists had plotted to assassinate Prime Minister Konoye due to his peace platform, and one diplomat had already been murdered for getting too close to Grew. So they decide their son, an army engineer, will ride the train with him. That way, reporters would think that Kurusu was seeing him off on a deployment. And the next morning, the two head out together, with Japan's last hope for peace sitting in Kurusu's briefcase. Thanks so much to GiveWell for not only helping everyone find highly effective charities, but also making sure that our donation dollars go further. The appointment of Hideki Tojo as Prime Minister seemed to put Japan on an inevitable path to war. But ironically, behind the scenes, it was the peace faction that considered him the best candidate.
That's interesting because I would think if I'm one of the nations like the United States, trying to negotiate and try to avert war with a nation like Japan, making militarists like Hideki Tojo your prime minister sends a pretty clear message that you're not interested in peace. And so it's interesting to hear that the peace factions in Japan saw him as someone that was actually hopeful for them.
After all, even if a diplomatic solution could be found, the new prime minister would need to be somebody with military pull. He would need to get the army on board with any agreement, and probably put down riots and attempted coups after the announcement of said agreement.
So I guess what they're seeing here is by having a military guy in this civilian position of authority, it's the best of both worlds. So I get that. That makes sense. But that, of course, assumes that Hideki Tojo is interested in peace, and I don't get the feeling from what I know of the man that that's the case.
And shockingly, it appeared they were right. Tojo himself was stunned by the appointment, and once in office, the enormity of Japan's predicament hit him. He now represented the whole country, and realized how dubious the Navy was about whether they could win a war with the US. So at a series of high-level meetings in November, he reopened the question of a diplomatic solution.
Okay, so it's not that he's not a militarist, it's not that he's not somebody who's interested in fighting, but he's a realist. So he's recognizing that this war with the United States would not be in Japan's best interest. Makes total sense.
What could be done? Are we even sure we can win a war? What will be the consequences? He even proposed revisiting the decision from the Imperial Conference of September 6th, laying out that if diplomatic efforts failed, war would be declared on America, Britain, and the Netherlands. This was unbelievable. Reversing an imperial decision was unprecedented in Japanese history.
So why Britain and the Netherlands? Because Britain and the Netherlands control areas in the South Pacific that Japan would need for natural resources. So if they're going to go to war, those are the people you need to go to war with.
These contentious meetings lasted for up to 14 hours at a time. Several civilian leaders even suggested a war would be so devastating, it would actually be preferable for Japan to accept a time of economic hardship and humiliation rather than fight one. Though army leaders shot back quick, saying the country was already rationing and food prices spiking due to the American embargo. Better to declare war and have a small chance of victory than to accept the conditions of defeat without even fighting. But finally, Tojo and his new foreign minister, Shigenori Togo, emerged with a last-ditch effort for peace. They would make two proposals to Roosevelt, Proposal A and Proposal B. In Proposal A, Japan would agree to negotiate an end to the Sino-Japanese War, make an initial troop drawdown, and withdraw all troops from China over a 25-year period. And in Proposal B, Japan would immediately reverse its troop movements to the southern portion of Indochina, freeze military deployments in Southeast Asia, and pledge to remove all troops from Indochina once the war in China was concluded. In return, America would end its aid to nationalist China, sell Japan oil, and broker trade agreements for rubber and other materials.
So this makes total sense on Japan's part. It seems like, especially option B, they're not giving up a whole lot. Even option A, we're not going to pull out completely for 25 years. Well, they're recognizing a lot can change in 25 years. And there's plenty of time to renegotiate that deal. Right now, we just need to deal with the immediate problem. And if dealing with the immediate problem means making a promise for 25 years down the road, that maybe 25 years from now we'll be in a very different situation, that seems like a pretty advantageous deal for Japan.
Of course, they had greater hopes for Proposal B, since it was more concrete, immediate, and managed to avoid the thorny issue of China. The plan was to give Roosevelt Proposal A, then if it was declined, present Proposal B, and if both were turned down, it would be war. The military pressed for a new deadline, a date after which diplomacy was considered to have failed. Tojo managed to haggle almost a month out of them. So on November 5th, as Kurusu boarded his train, Tojo and his ministers sat down with Emperor Hirohito for a new imperial conference. They outlined the proposals, the dire costs of the American embargo, and the proposed attack on Pearl Harbor. The emperor gave his assent. If peace was not found by December 1st, the attack would go ahead. The next day, when Nomura presented Proposal A to Secretary of State Hull, he found him unenthusiastic. That was pretty much expected.
Yeah.
What wasn't expected, however, was that Hull and Roosevelt would take until November 14th to formally turn it down. So much later than anticipated, Nomura and Kurusu tried Proposal B. What they didn't know at that juncture, however, was that Hull already knew about this alternate proposal. Because over at the Magic program, its staff of military officers and code-breaking women, known as Code Girls, had already intercepted and deciphered the proposals when they were sent to Nomura via the Purple Code.
There's a story right there, right? The Code Girls, that might be one worth making a video about down the road. Interesting. I talk about this all the time. The importance of code breaking and code making during this period in history is so important to understanding this period in history. It was huge. How often codes were being cracked and deciphered, and we're all familiar if you study the Pacific War with the famous code breaking that went on with the Battle of Midway, and how that battle hinged on our ability to break Japan's code and figure out what they were up to. This is important stuff to understanding this time period.
So not only had Hull read both proposals, but he also read the government's instructions to Nomura about how to present them, which rubbed him the wrong way. See, while the Magic program was good at cracking Japanese codes, they were bad at translation. The program was underfunded, understaffed, and had no native Japanese speakers.
And that's important because you can translate words using, like a dictionary of words, right? But that doesn't necessarily help you understand the culture and the real meaning, because a word can mean one thing in one language and culture and mean something very different in another language and culture. And some languages, some words are much harsher than they are in other languages. Some cultures use certain words. I won't say any examples because they would be considered crude in my culture. that are very commonplace in their culture. So, having a native speaker who can not only explain the words, but also explain the intent behind that kind of language, super important.
And because diplomatic communications were conducted in formal Japanese, the resulting translations, while substantively accurate, appeared harsher and more demanding than the originals. Translators also inserted and removed words and phrases, making it appear like there was no room to maneuver, with basic errors like substituting the phrase "final concessions" with the more provocative "ultimatum." Seriously, you put these things side by side, and it is pretty glaring.
So let's look at this. The present negotiations are our final effort and the security of the empire depends on it. Or the present negotiations are our final effort. In fact, we gambled the fate of our land on the throw of this die. Yeah.
Hull was also, by this time, simply disinclined to believe anything Japan said. Its horrifying massacres in China and obvious preparations to invade Southeast Asia, confirmed again by the Purple Intercepts, meant that despite his friendship with Nomura, he considered the negotiations untrustworthy. Not to mention, Hull also disliked Kurusu, seeing him as a Nazi ally, since he'd signed the Tripartite Act on behalf of Japan.
So let's acknowledge here for just a second, while not absolving Japan of responsibility for their aggressive acts in places like China and other parts of the South Pacific, for some very obvious atrocities that go along with those aggressive acts, for a pretty powerfully pro-war stance in all of this. Let's not completely absolve the United States, especially the diplomatic corps, of at least a little bit of responsibility in making this thing worse.
So Hull and Roosevelt slow-walked their response to Proposition B, considering it carefully, as they also tracked Japanese forces moving into position outside of Hong Kong, in Indochina, and in ports across Japan. Purple intercepts and phone taps made it clear that Japan was talking peace, but preparing for war. To them, it appeared Japan would...
And honestly, on the surface, if you take away all the other war they're already involved in, right? If we just isolate this to a Japan versus United States thing, there is nothing wrong as a nation with talking peace, but preparing for war. That's just the responsible thing to do. If you feel like war is going to happen, you have to prepare for it. The problem is when the preparation for war makes the war itself inevitable, which we absolutely see happen in World War I.
Was using diplomacy to stall their way to a better military position, and they were right. Secrecy around the Pearl Harbor attacks was incredibly tight, and the
We've had a lot of very cool references here. We've seen Elsa from Frozen, we saw an Uno reverse card, and now we see a Lord of the Rings reference to when Gandalf tells Frodo about the ring. He says, "Keep it secret, keep it safe." That's what we see there.
Secrecy around the Pearl Harbor attacks was incredibly tight, and the cabinet had specifically agreed to keep diplomats like Nomura and Kurusu out of the loop to make the bluff more convincing. Ensign Yoshikawa, the spy embedded in the Honolulu consulate from the episode earlier, didn't actually know either. He only knew he was supposed to pump drunk Marines for information and to skin dive at night in the harbor channel looking for submarine nets. Increasingly, he was told to create a grid map of the harbor and cable what ships were berthed in which sections. It was clear to intelligence groups, both in the US and Britain, that Japanese forces were preparing to hit something, but what?
If you're intercepting communications from the island of Oahu to the Japanese military that include very detailed references to what specific ships are in Pearl Harbor, isn't it rather obvious that Pearl Harbor is a target? And then to know, for example, that the U.S. had at this time we have very primitive radar, and we've got this radar station on the north end of the island of Oahu that very famously picks up the Japanese attack force coming in, but radar only operates a couple hours a day, and they were getting ready to shut down for the day, and they kind of are like, oh yeah, it's a flight of B-17s coming in from the mainland. Well, I would think if you are aware that they're scouting out Pearl Harbor and things are going downhill, you'd be a little more vigilant. So all of this is to say, this is why people have the conspiracy theories that have some, where there's smoke, there's fire, and there's definitely some smoke here that make it look quite plausible that Theodore Roosevelt knew the Japanese were going to attack the United States, and that this was something he allowed to happen in order for us to get into a war that he very much wanted to get involved in. I'm not willing to go that far, but I can see why people think that.
Singapore? The Philippines? The Dutch East Indies, maybe? Perhaps some combination. That last one seemed the most likely. And for months, British and Dutch diplomats had begged Roosevelt for even a verbal agreement that the three powers would fight together should they be attacked. But still, Hull and Roosevelt remained evasive. An agreement was premature. They were still negotiating with Japan. However, they did send out an alert to U.S. forces in the Philippines, Midway, Wake, and Hawaii that a conflict might be coming. However, this warning was so vague that individual commanders interpreted it in wildly different ways. In the Philippines, it was seen as a caution that ships might strike Singapore, in which case America may need to provide air support. While at Pearl Harbor, it was seen as a warning of possible sabotage by the local Japanese-American population.
Which leads to a disastrous decision that I'm sure he's going to talk about.
An air commander responded by grouping planes close together on the runway where they were easier to guard and easier to bomb. But no one in the Roosevelt administration, apart from a few outliers, truly considered Pearl a target for a Japanese strike. To do it, the Imperial Japanese Navy would have to sail far north into freezing waters before turning down into the mid-Pacific tropics. They'd risk exposure if they were spotted by even a single merchant ship, aircraft, or PBY Catalina patrols out of Midway. And a surprise carrier-based air raid at such long range had never been done before. We assumed they had good sense.
So there's another debate that goes on here, right? The idea of how much did these navies understand the importance of carrier warfare and carrier-based planes and things like that? Or was the mindset still that battleships are what mattered the most? And, there's argument about, that being a part of why people didn't think the Japanese could do this, because they didn't really think that highly of carrier-based operations yet. There's also the argument about whether or not the Japanese were really after the aircraft carriers at Pearl, or whether they were after the battleships as their main target, because the carriers were out of port at the time and weren't present when the attack happens, things like that.
Said one American commander after the war. Another admitted in racist terms that they simply didn't think the Japanese had the capability. Given the fleet movements, Roosevelt scrapped his more conciliatory counterproposal, and instead, he and Hull drew up a list of 10 hardball points, known as the Hull Note, including a full Japanese troop withdrawal from China and Indochina, abandonment of the Tripartite Pact, and to cease supporting puppet governments in China. Then, Japan could return to most favored nation status, and both countries would leave China. And they delivered that to Nomura November 26th. On December 2nd, an undetected fleet under Admiral Nagumo, already a third of its way to Hawaii, received a coded message from Yamamoto. Climb Mount Nitaka. The code that diplomacy had failed, and that the attack would begin.
All right, so it looks like we got another episode yet. We're going to talk about Pearl Harbor itself, so let me know your thoughts about all that. Let's continue this conversation. Love learning together. Excited to do that. Now that I've got internet again, we'll get back to daily content, daily shorts about specific things, and I've got some really interesting stuff that I want to talk about in some of those shorts coming up. So excited to do that. Let me know your thoughts. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to part 6 of the Path to Pearl Harbor. Fantastic new series from Extra History. This is the day of infamy, so we are on to the attack on Pearl Harbor itself. If you have not seen the first 5 episodes of my reaction to this, there's a link in the description. It'll take you back to the combined episode 1 and 2 reaction, and you can watch it from there. I'll also put the link to the original content so you can check that out and support them as well. Let's dive right in.
Honolulu, Tuesday, December 2nd, 1941. Japanese spy Takeo Yoshikawa senses war closing in. A delegation of Japanese specialists had come to survey Pearl Harbor, leaving him a list of questions. And he found the answers to them via observation, gossip, and local media reports.
And let's remember here, this is December 2nd, so I think November 26th, the Japanese fleet gets the go-ahead to launch the attack. I believe that's the day they left their home port. So this attack's a go at this point, 5 days before the attack. He's getting last-minute intelligence, not as a contingency. This is happening.
But now, a message comes from Tokyo, ordering him to report daily what ships are in port, whether the harbor has barrage balloons, if there are any anti-torpedo nets. Yes, his mission is definitely nearing its end.
So why torpedo nets? Because, well, obviously they're using torpedoes for the planes, but also they want to protect against submarines, because the Japanese do actually send this little mini sub into Pearl Harbor, and it's actually the first shots of the war for the United States are fired. I think it's the USS Ward, who fires on and sinks this Japanese mini sub.
He even passed some espionage duties to a German-American agent loyal to Nazi Germany. Still, each day he listens to the weather report on Radio Tokyo, waiting to hear the specific words: east wind, rain. The coded message that meant Japan was at war with the United States. And he won't have to wait long, for Admiral Nagumo's strike force is already a third of the way to Hawaii. Thanks so much to Factor for keeping us well fed on a busy schedule. Wednesday, December 3rd, the Oval Office. Roosevelt has been meeting regularly with Navy leadership. Japanese fleets are moving into Southeast Asia, but no one knows what the target is. One group of 6 carriers has simply disappeared. The general consensus is that Japan will strike Malaya, Hong Kong, or the Dutch East Indies within days.
If you're an intelligence person, though, that's got to frighten you a little bit. When you completely lose track of carriers like that, and you know they're headed somewhere, but you have no idea where.
Some even fear that they're planning a surprise attack on the Philippines, though that's a minority opinion.
And we have to remember, for those who aren't familiar with it, the Philippines is a U.S. territory at this point. This is where MacArthur is, with a pretty large American presence.
Roosevelt then meets with the British ambassador and finally gives him the answer he's been begging for. If Japan attacks British or Dutch territory, America will support their fight. Later that day, Stanley Jones, an old friend of Roosevelt and a missionary to Japan, visits him. And in his pocket is one last gambit for peace, cooked up by Ambassador Nomura and Special Envoy Caruso, using Jones to get around the increasingly hostile Cordell Hull. Caruso wants Roosevelt to go over the heads of the militarists and cable the emperor directly, offering to negotiate an end to the war in China. Hull dislikes this idea. The FBI has reported smoke at the Japanese embassy. They're already burning documents. War could start any minute. Though, after considering, Roosevelt decides he will send the cable.
You have to try, right? I mean, you have to do everything you can. If there's an opportunity for a last-ditch piece, but by this point, it's pretty clear that the odds are pretty heavy that you're going to war. It's just a matter of when and how and where this is going to happen first.
One last chance at peace. And if he had sent it that day, it might have arrived in time to make a difference. Instead, he'll send it the evening of December 6th. Thursday, December 4th, Tokyo. For hours, Tojo's cabinet has been drafting a response to Hull's list of demands that we mentioned last episode. And the reply they're crafting is a 14-point statement of grievances, with the last one being the most crucial, saying America's position has made further negotiation impossible. It severs diplomatic relations, with war inferred.
So, we've tried, but peace is impossible, and it's your fault. Pretty typical stuff that either side would probably say.
Rather than declared. The foreign minister hates this. He insists the statement be delivered before the strike. The honor of Japan depends on it. Yeah, the Navy says they'll get back to him on timing.
So you have to understand, I mean, the whole point of this Japanese attack is that they know long-term they can't win a war against the United States. This is all about surprise and a quick strike that cripples the American Pacific Fleet and buys Japan time to get in a strong enough position to negotiate a settlement with the United States. They know they can't win long term. And so any advantage the Navy can get in that, even if it means launching a surprise attack when the U.S. isn't ready for it. But what the Navy's not thinking about here is the downside of this, that you are angering the American public in a way that's going to unite them behind this war significantly. Because, otherwise you might have a situation where the U.S. is, they've been pretty isolationist, and maybe a lot of people are still not 100% convinced that we really need to fight this. But when the Japanese do what they do the way that they do it, That leaves no doubt to the American people. They want revenge. They want to get back at them, and they want to do it now.
The timing of the attack is still secret after all. And then, a full day later, they finally respond. The statement must be delivered at precisely 1 p.m. Washington time. They also say the foreign ministry should wait and send the 14th part, the one breaking off relations, until just hours before the attack. Saturday, December 6th, Washington. Dorothy Edgers is a Japanese translator in the Navy's cryptographic section and is working the weekend to catch up on magic intercepts. The program is understaffed, subject to Army-Navy turf battles, and, frankly, intercepts more than they can decode and translate. Now there's some low-priority messages out of Honolulu that need seeing to. Of course, those communications are probably mostly commercial rather than diplomatic, but she's not one to let things stack up. She sees one from December 2nd, where Tokyo asks about barrage balloons and torpedo nets. Then a reply the next day about a German agent in Hawaii. But when the head of the translation section, Lieutenant Commander Alvin D. Creamer, arrives that afternoon, he isn't alarmed. Edgers is new to this work. He's seen stuff like this before. Japanese consulates monitor ship traffic at every port. He mostly nitpicks her rough translation, then decides it isn't good enough to pass on.
So this is one of those situations where if people had all the pieces of the puzzle, they'd put it together, right? If the guys in Washington knew about this conversation, that would mean more than it does to these two, right? And if these two were aware of what the folks in Washington knew, they would be taking this much more seriously. But everybody's got a little piece of the puzzle, and it's not, there's not enough cooperation going on. Same kind of thing happened on 9/11, for example, where you've got different government agencies that all have pieces of a puzzle that if they had been communicating better together, they might have known what was happening.
Go enjoy your weekend, he says. We'll finish this up on Monday. Meanwhile, across town at the Japanese embassy, the first 13 parts of the statement start to come in. But there's a goodbye party for one of the embassy staff, and the senior secretary only gets partway through the decryption before he's pulled into a ping pong tournament. And the history books don't tell us whether he won or not.
Ping pong. Sometimes history hinges on ping pong, right? I mean, little things like that have huge ramifications that nobody realizes at the time.
But back at the Navy cryptographic office, Creamer now also receives the 13-point statement, intercepted when it was sent to the Japanese embassy. Recognizing its importance, he jumps up, and not having a staff car, gets his wife to drive him to the White House. Reading the statement and its belligerent tone, Roosevelt then says, "This means war." As emergency calls go out, with military officials being pulled out of theaters and called away from dinner parties, everyone in Washington now knows something's up. Sunday, December 7th. Around 8 a.m. Washington time, the 14th and final part of the statement breaking off relations, and the instructions saying it must be presented to Hull at exactly 1 p.m., arrives at the Japanese embassy. And as before, it too is intercepted, and Creamer gets a decrypted copy. And when he sees there's a delivery time specified in the instructions, his bad feeling gets much worse. Meanwhile, at the Japanese embassy, Nomura is freaking out. The decryption staff has all gone home to nurse hangovers, and it's 10 a.m. before he can get anyone back to decrypt the instructions.
The party from the night before still having an impact today. I knew some of this. I didn't know about that. I knew there were some decryption issues.
And that's when he finds out about the 1 p.m. delivery time. That is not enough time to work this document. He has to carefully translate this formal declaration to English before presenting it to Hull. Okay, panicking, he calls Hull's office. Can he please get a 1 p.m. appointment?
Oh, sorry, sir. Secretary Hull has a lunch meeting. Could you possibly do 2 p.m.?
No. He insists it must be no later than 1 p.m. And with that, gets the appointment. Nomura hovers over his senior secretary as the man, who can't type, mind you, it's more of a hunt and peck kind of action, translates the first 13 parts of the statement from Japanese to English. He finishes, but there are so many errors, it's nearly illegible. They start retyping the entire thing. Meanwhile, American leaders are frantic over the possible significance of the 1 p.m. delivery of that last ominous message. Why so specific? Was an attack imminent? Sabotage, perhaps? They send warnings to the Philippines and the Panama Canal, but weather conditions mean that Hawaii can't be raised. And with phone messages possibly being tapped, exposing the fact that the purple code is broken, they instead opt to send a Western Union telegram.
A telegram, which goes into somebody's box and not read right away.
They forget to mark it urgent. At 6:30 a.m. Hawaiian time, at the mouth of Pearl Harbor, a destroyer spots the conning tower of a submarine. They sink it and then send a warning to headquarters, though it's dismissed. After all, jumpy captains were always mistaking driftwood or turtle heads for periscopes. Then at 7:06 a.m. Hawaiian time, a radar unit picks up a wave of airplanes inbound. They call it in and are told not to worry. It's a flight of B-29s transferring in. They're just early.
Think that's a little mistake on our extra history friends' part. I think they were B-17s. I don't think B-29s existed yet in 1941. Very rare that we catch them making a mistake like that, or maybe just, I don't know them. I know they do a lot of lies episodes, so maybe this is going to be for one of those.
Meanwhile, in Washington, it's 12:30 p.m., and Nomura is losing his mind. It's only 30 minutes until they're meeting with Hull, and he's just been handed the decrypted 14th part, breaking off relations. In addition, Tokyo has just sent corrections to the first 13 parts of the statement, and now multiple pages have to be retyped. Jeez. They're going to be late for their 1 p.m. delivery. In Honolulu, civilians wake in confusion. Smoke rises over Pearl Harbor, and airplanes buzz across the sky. Okay, what idiot scheduled a big naval exercise on a Sunday morning of all times? Yoshikawa knows different. He rushes to the consulate just in time to hear the weather report. East wind, rain. 10 minutes after he's done torching his codebooks and all evidence of espionage, armed FBI agents break down the door. He raises his hands and identifies himself as a diplomat. Now, much later, he'll return to Japan on a diplomatic exchange, his activities not revealed until decades later. Rather, Japanese Americans, who he never enlisted as agents because he found them too loyal to the U.S., will be blamed instead.
True, and there's a couple things about this, and granted, we all know in hindsight that it was abhorrent what was done to Japanese Americans with the internment camps, which, by the way, very few Japanese Americans in Hawaii were interned. Most of the Japanese Americans who are interned are going to be on the mainland. There's a lot of reasons for that, one of which is that there's already martial law in Hawaii, and so they feel more confident in the security that's already in place. There are other reasons as well, but like just a small number. There were Japanese Americans on Hawaii that were interned, though, just not a lot. And of course, we know that Japanese Americans fought bravely and superbly for the United States military, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, some of the best troops in the American Army during the war, fighting in places like Italy. And you got Daniel Inouye, who will become a senator, gets the Medal of Honor, a Japanese American fighting for the United States. So, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting how often this happens with espionage. The spies are covered up so well that sometimes it's decades or even longer before we find out. Washington's spy ring, the Culper ring, we didn't know the identity of some of the Culper ring from the 1780s until the last couple of decades. It's pretty intense stuff.
Washington, 2:20 p.m. Nomura and Kurusu enter Hull's office. They don't know that 15 minutes earlier, Roosevelt had informed Hull of the ongoing attack at Pearl Harbor, an attack neither diplomat knows about. Nomura stretches out his hand, but Hull does not take it. Instead, he flips through the 14-point statement and icily asks why it had to be delivered at 1 p.m. Nomura, apologizing for being late, says he doesn't know. And it's at this point that Hull launches into Nomura. In all of their dealings, he says, he's always been honest and straightforward. And he'd hoped Nomura did the same. Yet now, here, he brings this statement full of lies and distortions.
You gotta feel bad for Nomura because he's put in this situation where he really just hasn't done anything wrong. He just is the odd man out here. He's caught in the middle of stuff that is above his pay grade, that he had no involvement in the decision-making process, and he's got to be the messenger. Don't shoot the messenger. Well, this poor guy.
Then Hull dismisses them. Nomura, still confused, reaches out his hand to shake once more. This time, Hull accepts. Then they exit the office into a mob of press. The next day, Roosevelt would use their late delivery of the statement as part of his Day of Infamy speech. A speech that created a clean, righteous narrative out of the complicated, multi-decade breakdown of American-Japanese relations.
See, this is why these things matter so much, right? Like he said, it's complicated. It's been years of very nuanced negotiations and decisions and mistakes and demands and concessions. And all of that gets thrown out the window because they were late with the delivery of the declaration of war. That changes the entire narrative.
A story that began in the 19th century as two Pacific empires took their first tentative steps towards each other in a dance of imperial cooperation and collision, and a story that would be burned into the popular consciousness under three powerful words. Remember Pearl Harbor.
All right, that was good stuff. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. I've got a video coming tomorrow, my top 10 favorite historic sites that I visited in 2022. So hopefully you'll check that out. And then I'll have some more top 10 lists coming in the next week or so. So be watching for those as well. Thanks for watching.